Hello and welcome to the first episode of Plant Culture. In this episode we'll cover the history of the gardens of the Umayyad society in Al-Andalus. The Al-Andalus was a civilization that had great gardens that were admired by Muslims as well as Christians and Jewish people throughout the medieval and modern era. We'll cover the gardens that dwelt in this region from the 8th century to the Caliphate Era. You'll start with the Emirate period, which lasted between the 8th and 9th century AD. During this time period, the first king of the Umayyad region was Abd al-Rahman, known by another name al-Ruf-Safa, after the Syrian palace built by his grandfather. The palace held extensive estates just outside the city, which were similar to Roman villas. This served as housing for dignitaries, as well as agricultural and garden land, mainly used for recreation. There's also a Roman hydraulic system from the 1st century CE, indicating that this garden was built long before Islam came around, and the Muslims simply maintained it. Another source suggests that a Berber chieftain conquered this location and constructed this all from scratch, obtaining extensive gardens and rare plants from far and wide, as well as the various materials used to build the irrigation system. And then this Berber king passed on his gardens and estate to his heirs, which continued to rule this region for a time. This was then conquered by the Islamic tribes, who then made use of the technology that they developed. It's still heavily debated whether or not the irrigation system was of Roman built or Berber built, with one argument being that the Berber group would likely know how to take advantage of the existing hydraulic system and run with it to the highest degree, bringing plans from elsewhere to convert the region into a large prosperous area. But other researchers have found that there's a long historical role of the Berbers using a similar hydraulic system, and that the Berber tribes of the Hawara region had extensive knowledge of hydraulics. There's various speculations on what it was used for. Some say it was a fortified villa, and others say it's a botanical garden. The latter argue that since there's many opponents of the Umayyad regime in the capital, building the center of power outside of the capital would be ideal from a strategic standpoint. And since the walls are built for war, so it seems, this lends credence to that idea. But the sheer number of plants grown in the garden areas and the work on acclimatizing different crops to that environment seems to suggest that it was a botanical garden. During the 9th century, many plants that are used for foods and vegetables were also grown for ornamental purposes, and a great many food crops were grown in that region, and that number increased during the 9th century. As the gardens began to grow, various poems were written about these gardens, such as the one seen here. And during the lifetime of Muhammad, one of the princes of this region had begun developing war wheels. And since Muhammad had some interactions with this region, the depiction of paradise must have been loosely based off of these gardens. Speaking of which, now onto the Caliphate Era. During the era of the Caliphate, Abd Allah, the king of that region during the Caliphate Era, took extensive tolls on the culture of that region, effectively changing the way science was done during that time period. Although at that point, science continued to be practiced due to the interest of the courts. Cultural and scientific activity grew later on thanks to the patronage of the next in line king, Al-Hakam II, while he was still a prince. And during the 10th century, medicine flourished in terms of herbalism, and a great many works were done into the integration of medicine and diet. During this time, the plants within the gardens were studied extensively, and writings about medicine, diet, and healthcare were booming at that time. Many of the sources used by the Islamic community were of course Quranic in origin, but it also made use of the Gaelic and other Greek texts on medical herbs of that time period. And there's many translations of ancient Greek writings, such as the Materia Medica by Dioscorides, which was sponsored by yet another king of Umayyad and various physicians also wrote during that time period, studying the different flowers that dwelt in these gardens. These writings were later compiled into the work known as the Calendar of Cordoba and the Al-Anwa. This contained the list of different herbal remedies, medicinal plants, and ornamental plants. It was also during this time that botanical gardens began appearing at that region as well, and the philosophical tradition of the Caliphate cultural world began to be built from this, and the gardens of this region became the template for the gardens of Madinat al-Zahra, which was a city palace developed by Abd al-Rahman III in 936. During this time period, the Umayyads had a rival called the Fatimids of Iraqifiyya, which built their own garden to rival the Umayyad garden. Since these two regions were Sunni and Shiite respectively, this rivalry was religious in nature. Both were trying to project a partial vision of paradise, and both were visited by the imams of their respective sects to see how close they are to the vision of paradise. And the Caliph of the Umayyad was also following the philosophy of Al-Farabi, an Islamic philosopher that synthesized the Aristotelian and Platonic philosophies into his own theory of ethics, leading to this philosophy was based around building a philosopher king around a perfected garden city-state. Consequently, another reason for the building of this garden would be to create the ideal city-state, and for the leader to be the philosopher king. Al-Farabi's philosophy was based around the ideal city was intimately tied through religion, through the Neoplatonic idea of the imitation of God, where the goal of the human being is to become as much like God as possible, through doing good and acquiring wisdom, and as a result, reconstructing the divine on earth, which would be another reason for the imams being invited to look over the garden, and another reason for its immense size and grandeur. Well, that about covers everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this video. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to me on BitChute for a greater variety of content, 4 videos a week. And thank you to all my subscribers on both platforms. I appreciate it.